Shahid, thanks for coming on. I really appreciate you coming on and having a conversation with me. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself before we get started?
Sure, thanks. My name's Shahid. I'm a constitutional lawyer. I'm an artist. I'm running to represent my city, San Francisco, in the U.S. House of Representatives. I'm challenging the incumbent as the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi. We won 81,000 votes in 2020 after winning the jungle primary alongside her, and I'm looking forward to finishing the job of liberating my city's voice in Washington this November.
Awesome. What are your motivations? Why do you hate Nancy Pelosi?
I don't hate anybody. I do abhor corruption. And I ultimately ran for this seat to challenge and expose it. I have an affirmative agenda, which includes expanding human rights to include and encompass all basic human needs. So housing, healthcare, food. I'd like particularly to include climate justice within that set, not just of individual human rights, but a collective right that we all share. And as part of that, I want not only to back and promote and ultimately help secure the Green New Deal, I'd like to nationalize the fossil fuel sector. It's an unexplored component of climate justice. It frankly disturbs me that the climate justice movement isn't talking about it more, but the incompatibility of the profit motive with the need to keep it in the ground is what we're getting at there. So I have a policy proposal around that. I've had some thinking about how to deal with the Supreme Court that we could get into. And I've spent a lot of my career fighting government surveillance. I see the threat to conscience and liberty that it presents. And I recognize the co-optation of particularly San Francisco's voices in Congress. Not just Pelosi, but Feinstein is actually a particular architect of the NSA dragnet. And for a city that's played such a crucial role in helping develop the internet, for our city's voices to be part of the effort to turn it into a tool for global surveillance, to me, it's offensive. So I don't hate anyone. I just see the policy record here, and I can't just watch it. I can't look away.
So when you say nationalize fossil fuel, does that mean make a government organization that runs the vast majority of the fossil fuel industry, kind of like in other countries? I believe it's like Norway or Sweden or something has like 80% fossil fuel something.
More or less, yeah. One way this could look, in fact, the way I'd like it to look, is first passing a series of measures that ensure corporate liability for climate harm, which would then basically do to the fossil fuel sector much of what the tobacco litigation era did to tobacco companies. And then once those companies are more appropriately valued, given the harms that they're going to be responsible for paying out to plaintiffs, then for the government basically to buy those companies. Sort of like in 2008 when Obama bailed out the banks. A lot of people were concerned that he could have claimed equity in the banks and just gave them loans instead. Here, this would be the government basically purchasing the equity of the fossil fuel companies so that instead of being accountable to shareholders seeking to maximize value, those companies would be accountable to the public. And that's the only way to ramp down production. If we allow the private monetization and sale of scarce non-renewable natural resources, as the supply drops, the price will inevitably increase. That's why we have fracking, because it's lucrative to pump every last bit out of the ground, however destructive it is environmentally. And we have to end that era. And it's not that complicated. It just takes the political will. And part of that will involves speaking what the policies are. And I'm astounded that there's not a single voice in Congress calling for this. It's an absolute imperative. As long as we're on this subject of climate justice and imperatives that are going unaddressed, it happens to be Memorial Day, and rationalizing the Pentagon and the military industrial complex is also a crucial component of climate justice that few people connect. And these are just some of the reasons why ultimately I'd like to help defend the future in Washington.
Yeah, for sure. You also mentioned affordable housing. In Minnesota, we have a thing called the Naturally Occurring Affordable Housing Fund. It's a nonprofit fund that purchases apartment buildings, and it's a nonprofit, so it provides them at an affordable rate. Are you going to provide more support for those kinds of programs?
I'm certainly open to that. I'd like to go beyond it. We have across the United States, real estate markets that are commodified. They basically treat housing as pretext for people to get rich instead of basic human rights. In San Francisco, for instance, we have tens of thousands of homeless residents, people who sleep without shelter every night. We have more empty units than we do homeless people. And that's simply idiotic. There's no reason for that. I think creating a right to housing, at least at a subsistence level, repealing the Faircloth Amendment, that was a law passed, I think, in 1979 by the Congress that effectively prevents the federal government from building new housing. And we need to repeal the Faircloth Amendment to make substantial investments, not just in supporting nonprofits in the way that you're describing, but building housing. In San Francisco, supply is a big part of the problem, and the resources to enable that supply, they're beyond the reach of the federal government, beyond the local government. This is where the federal government can make a huge impact, particularly in communities where the real estate prices are not as inflated as they are here. But yeah, I'd like to get beyond the cursory measures that have been introduced in the past. As long as we're on that point of the bridge, proposals that aren't quite as visionary but can make a difference in the meantime. There's a budget line in the federal budget for the community development block grants. This is a program through HUD, Housing and Urban Development, that funds big grants to states, which then divide them up and hand them out to cities, which then hand them out to property developers to incentivize affordable units. The budget for that has collapsed over the last generation. And at the very, very least, I would like us to be spending as much on that budget line as we are for weapons for other countries. And if we did that, that alone, frankly, would probably fix the affordable housing crisis in the United States. But Congress has been decidedly more willing to sell weapons than it has been to deal with the needs of the American people. And that's ultimately, again, another reason why I'm running.
So what is the Faircloth Amendment? What was the motivation behind it? And why doesn't the government have more ability to build homes in San Francisco?
So it was passed in response to what you might describe as an era of federal housing development that fell on the shoals of poor planning. So in the 50s, 60s, to some extent in the 70s, so it started tapering off then, there were a series of federal housing developments built around the country that basically fell into disrepair and ruin. And particularly during the crack epidemic, when incidentally the CIA was driving this, we had lots of public safety issues around the United States. Public housing developments became, in some places, unfortunate epicenters of criminal activity. And so that was one of the things I think that informed the passage of the Faircloth Amendment. It is the reason why the passage of the Faircloth Amendment changed the law so that the government can't directly invest in property acquisition and development. And so that's why repealing it is so crucial, because that would then enable some of the money in the federal budget, instead of only going to block grants to states to incentivize affordable housing development by private developers. Repealing Faircloth puts us in a position to start building housing directly for the people, by the people, owned by the people, without a rent extraction maximizing landlord on the other side of the process. And so to build a new era of social housing owned by the government, but this is an important part, accountable to the residents in a way that the previous era of federal housing was not. That and the surrounding community, I think that's a crucial step forward to learn from the past, but not to throw the baby of federal spending on housing out with the bathwater of these lessons that people learned from the failures of a previous era. Did that make sense? I know that was
Yeah, absolutely. I do have a question though. What do you mean by accountable to the tenants, the local community? What exactly would that mean?
It could be things like tenants unions having say in a monthly meeting about the governance of the space. And I meant to say residents and surrounding community. One of the challenges with the previous era of housing was precisely that there was no accountability at all. It was federal management and then local residents who didn't have a particular say in anything like, what the hours of access to a recreational space might be, or what the security policies are. And similarly, the surrounding communities had no input. And so the key here is to have federal resources matched with local input so that you're not just investing in communities with a blunt hand and no listening. Another example of this here in San Francisco I can point to, in the 70s, one of our few Black neighborhoods in San Francisco, the Fillmore, was basically destroyed in an urban redevelopment project that was funded with federal dollars. And it epitomized this era of the federal government having so heavy a hand that it was basically destroying communities more than supporting them. And so the accountability to residents and communities is crucial to make sure that federal resources are actually being helpful, instead of, as they did here in San Francisco 40 years ago, destroying a generation of Black wealth.
Yeah, for sure. How exactly would you get approval for this when you get into Senate? Like what is the process to actually gain enough support to try and get approval for these kinds of projects? Because especially for like nationalized fuel and fossil fuels, that seems very challenging to get enough support in Congress to actually get that to pass.
Yeah, what you're describing is sort of the tension between vision and execution. And so there's sort of a spectrum. There's different ways to get different things passed. If you're talking about a vision that is transformative, like the Green New Deal, for instance, you go to the public and you build public support for it and you start flipping seats based on the vision. For instance, one reason I'm running against Pelosi is because I think the Green New Deal is a sufficiently compelling vision that we should be flipping this seat over that. I want to remind me if I get lost, because I'm going to go on a tangent before I come back to your question, and I do want to address it, but I just want to hit the Green New Deal piece in particular. I live in a city that is absolutely committed to climate justice. We will march every weekend for it. There's actions all the time, and we're represented in Washington by agents of the climate catastrophe, Pelosi and Feinstein. There's a reason that the Sunrise Movement marched, I think it was 250 miles from a town that used to be called Paradise, California, until it burned to the ground in an inferno in 2017, maybe 2018. And after marching those hundreds of miles, the climate justice activists dumped wildfire ashes on the front lawns of Nancy Pelosi and Dianne Feinstein to thank them for their role in the climate crisis. And if San Francisco understood the active complicity of our city's voices in a global catastrophe that threatens life on Earth, I'm absolutely positive that we would send a new voice to Washington. And one of the key questions in our race is, will San Francisco have a chance to hear the alternatives on the ballot? To this point, the city has generally not. One reason I'm very grateful for having this conversation. So for a visionary measure like that, or for instance, nationalizing the fossil fuel sector, which in some respects goes even beyond the Green New Deal, the process to pass something like that really has to take, it involves public engagement. And so one crucial piece of it that's not happening at the moment is the translation of vision into policy. And I want to make this sharp. There's a reason that the Green New Deal has not been introduced as an act of Congress. And it's particularly because Nancy Pelosi blocked its proponent, Representative Ocasio-Cortez, from the seat on the Energy and Commerce Committee that would have been the platform to develop that legislation. And instead, Pelosi gave that seat to Kathleen Rice, a conservative Democrat, also from New York State. Interestingly enough, AOC supported Nancy Pelosi for the speaker. Kathleen Rice did not. And so the conservative House member who opposed Pelosi gets the seat over the young visionary with the policy proposal poised to keep a lot of kids and grandchildren alive. And that's just yet another example of the corruption. Now, the pathway to passing a bill that is not as visionary, one that's more marginal, one, for instance, like at this point, an example of this should be legalizing cannabis. There's a transpartisan consensus across the United States. There are members of Congress from both sides of the aisle who say they agree, yet still it hasn't happened. Passing a bill like that, where there is widespread support, is much more an organizing exercise. And that looks like, just to lay out some of the tactics that people inside the Hill use, and I'm familiar with this because as a public interest advocate, I spent a lot of time informing and trying to influence these decisions on behalf of civil liberties and civil rights issues at different nonprofits. You develop a piece of legislation, you shop it around to the people who you think might embrace it. They're your co-sponsors. You write a letter to your colleagues. You start organizing hearings so that then grassroots people can come to Congress and inform your colleagues about the issues you're trying to address. You take those hearings to the press. You take those news articles to candidates, and you hope that voters show up ultimately. And there's lots of points in that process where the train can go off the rails. Usually it's when you get to the press. The press rarely covers issues where Congress is trying to investigate and explore problems. And so the public generally is uninformed and concedes to whatever the inertia is, rather than holding accountable the institutional agents of these compounding crises. So it's an organizing exercise if it's more marginal. It's a public education and mobilizing exercise if it's more visionary. Does that get a little bit at the question?
Yeah, so I have two follow-up questions. One is, why do you think Nancy Pelosi would prioritize putting in a more conservative person into that position? What would be the motivation behind that? And my second question would be, when there is a large amount of agreement in the American public for certain policies like gun control, abortion rights, legalization of weed, why do you think it takes so long to actually get those passed, or some kind of a bill passed? Because we've had a large amount of agreement for many, many years on these topics in the public, but we haven't really gotten much progress in like the Senate on any of them.
Thank you. The answer to both of those questions ultimately is the same, and we'll unpack it in a couple different ways. I'll give you a one-word answer. I'll give you two different one-word answers. Corruption is the first and capital is the second. And let me share with you some of the ways in which capital corrupts the policymaking process and impedes objects of public consensus from finding their way into policy. The most obvious, which I'm grateful has finally drawn a public controversy. I've been concerned for years about policymaking trading stocks based on inside information. Now, over the last 6 months, that's become finally an object of national controversy, which I'm glad to have helped instigate. It remains, though, I'm frustrated by the translation to our point from before. I was talking about how journalists often fail to translate objects of investigation into public consciousness. This is a perfect example because it's frankly not about policymakers trading stocks based on inside information. That's like the tip of an iceberg. The problem is conflicts of interest and divided loyalties, and they get those in lots of different ways. Publicly traded stocks are frankly the least problematic among them because they're at least publicly traded. There's some disclosure around it. Private equity investments, hedge fund investments are completely unregulated. They're not even subject to disclosure requirements. And that's an open gateway to corporate influence. In other words, to put this more sharply, the answer to your question is that we have a Congress of millionaires that are filling their pockets at the public's expense. There is a constitutional prohibition against precisely that. It's called the Emoluments Clause. It prohibits self-enrichment by public officials in their public capacities. Now, the interesting thing about the Emoluments Clause is that as it relates to members of Congress, the only people who can enforce it are voters. Journalists, by extension, because they play a role in educating the public. But at the end of the day, we are talking about massive constitutional violations by more or less everyone in Congress. This is not an isolated problem. Pelosi is the literal poster child, but it's a widely shared problem. And this is an institutional corruption that has infected and inflected federal policy for decades, meaning that literally every act of Congress in the post-World War II era, we can fairly say has been inflected by an illegitimate conflict of interest with a Wall Street bent because of the personal pecuniary interests of the policymakers. When Dwight Eisenhower in 1961 coins the military-industrial complex in his speech warning about the pernicious influence it's going to have over democracy in America and how it will come to threaten our rights and liberties, his first version of the first draft of the speech referred to a military-industrial congressional complex, the extent to which members of Congress are personally invested in, for instance, defense stocks. That's an especially egregious case where we see the conflict of interest, the profit motive leading to millions of dead people around the world and maimed Americans coming home and shattered families. It's interesting to reflect upon that on Memorial Day, incidentally. My brother served in the U.S. Army, and so I understand at least a piece of what military families go through, and they deserve better than being expendable salespeople for weapons. That's what we use our military for ultimately, is to show weapons off to the rest of the world and then sell those contracts to other countries. And it's not okay. Service members sign up to defend America, not to sell weapons. And as a member of Congress, I would hope to stand in solidarity with them in more than just the performative way that so many people do today.
How do we actually make progress on that? How do we get things passed in Congress when it's against their financial interest to do so, to limit their ability to make money from the position?
Rats scurry from the sunlight. So there is a crucial role for journalism to play here. Transparency enables accountability if subsequent things happen too. I mean, I have a hard time answering that question without being very specific about it, because I am an agent of accountability against an agent of oligarchy, and I see the role of the press as actively complicit in entrenching the corruption that we combat. So as long as the press, for instance, covers Nancy Pelosi as if her policy record weren't revealing of hypocrisy at every conceivable turn, even just last week on gun rights, come back to that maybe in a minute if you want to. I've got a great story to tell about her hypocrisy on that issue, or Roe. But when the press gives powerful policymakers a free pass and fails to inform the public, either about their policy records or about their authoritarian patterns. Nancy Pelosi has never debated a challenger once in her career. She's been in office since 1987, and she's never debated a challenger, which is why San Francisco has no idea what her record is, because she's surrounded by a cult of personality constructed by the press. She ducks debates. She frankly smears her opponents. We could talk about that too if you're interested, all while filling her pockets, as we've discussed. And so the key to working around that is to expose corruption and hold people accountable. When I was talking about the emoluments clause and only voters can hold corrupt officials accountable for filling their pockets, the way you do that is you vote in replacements. And as someone auditioning to replace an oligarch who's literally a poster child of these problems, without aiming to be too self-serving about that, I'd say the way we do it is we build campaigns. We donate to campaigns. We volunteer with campaigns. We introduce campaigns to our friends and family. And we vote in new voices to remove the ones with problematic track records. So many things that came up there, but tell me where you want to go.
Yeah, so the news thing is really interesting because we seem to have a very bipartisan news structure as well as we do in a bipartisan political structure. How exactly do we get a more neutral news platform to be able to disseminate information equally on both sides rather than specifically describing information in such a way that it is beneficial towards one party or another who is backed by that particular news organization?
It's funny to have this conversation in an era in which social media is finally being held accountable for itself becoming part of the problem, because 10 years ago, people thought it was going to be the answer to that, right? I remember in the Arab Spring in 2011, there was this whole sustained news cycle about, Facebook and Twitter are going to promote democracy around the world because they let people speak. And then came algorithmic curation, and that was the end of that, right? So it's tough. I would say in microcosm, what we're doing right now is one piece of the answer, right? Grassroots media and independent journalists doing the work that the institutional media failed to do is one more than a drop in the bucket. I think frankly, the ranks of independent media for us in 2020 proved indescribably influential in creating opportunities for us to receive the support that we needed to challenge Pelosi, right? We won the jungle primary and then put her on her heels, forced her to change half a dozen different among her policy positions, I should say, on the way to winning 80,000 votes. And the independent media played a crucial role in exposing our campaign to people around the country who saw promise in my voice and the alternative that we offered. I should note, incidentally, you were asking me before about how do we get visionary bills passed. And I skipped over one that I just mentioned in passing, but just to unpack that, in addition to flipping seats and knocking out career policymakers who are complicit in our crises and replacing them with people with better alternatives. Another thing we can do on the way to that, by threatening those seats, even in races that we don't ultimately win, we are often able to force incumbents to shift. Now, you might perceive that as weak sauce. For me, I look at 2020 when we won 80,000 votes against the Speaker of the House, and as much as winning 80,000 votes against the Speaker of the House is a big deal, forcing her to shift her positions was frankly a bigger one because she's the Speaker of the House. Every bill that we flipped Pelosi on, the entire House of Representatives followed in her wake. That's how the Protecting Right to Organize Act passed the House. It's how the Justice and Policing Act passed the House. She didn't support either of them until she had to. Same story on the bill that funded the Postal Service. So there's this opportunity. A lot of people focus on political campaigns as if they were just political, but they're also policy levers. And the policy leverage that political challenges offer are an independent means of forcing change legislatively on a system that without challenges concedes nothing.
Yeah, for things you mentioned is that Pelosi's never debated anybody who she's gone up against. And as someone who's a professional debater, and that's pretty much all I do for a living, I'm a big advocate for debate. And there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of that in our culture, especially at the adult level. There's some debate at the high school level, at the college level, but when we get to adults, it seems to be like a social faux pas to ever debate anything. So would it be a good idea to have mandatory debates for political candidates in order to expose their position and have it in more of a interesting fashion? Because today the debates, like the presidential debates, seem to be kind of just pandering to your base, restating your positions, and don't really go into depth. You don't really get to be challenged or expose your underlying ideas behind things. How do we introduce debate into the political sphere and make it productive?
Thank you so much for that question. Yes, absolutely. Debates, I think, should be mandatory. The people to enact those ultimately would be state legislatures. State legislatures control election law, but they could absolutely empower secretaries of state to have things like debate commissions for each of the different offices. And there's no reason that they don't. It would make perfect sense. It would be democracy promoting. When people focus on voting rights, they're important, and they're just a piece of a broader puzzle. And like public financing of elections would be another part of that puzzle, or ranked choice voting, for instance. But here, where we're talking about the inability of the public to even get access to the information on which to base their election decisions, is ultimately enforced because we're conceding that space to the market. But this is a vital public good. Information about policy and the alternatives before the public, that is a public good. There's no reason to leave that to the market. And so commissions and mandatory debate provisions, I think, would be absolutely democracy enhancing. They would be corruption inhibitors, right? They would be in itself a check and balance on institutional corruption. I dare say that the kind of reform you described would be a constitutional enhancement. And it's one that we don't need a constitutional amendment to effectuate, because state legislatures can do it. Even at the city level, you can't necessarily mandate debates beyond the city, but boards of supervisors and city councils, they could pass bills that require candidates for seats in those bodies to sit for debates. And I think it would be really important. One gloss, kind of tying together two parts of our conversation, you were talking about how among adults, debate is not encouraged. And I just remember I had a chance to offer Sean Hannity his ass on his program in 2005. I was the spokesperson for the counter-inaugural demonstrations, greeting Bush to office the second time he was selected over the will of the people. And in that capacity, I saw what passes for debate among adults. And it's just demagoguery, ultimately. And I found in that space that being a reasonable voice and just speaking my mind and being not bombastic about it, I've seen the clip used by trainers since then as an example of how to use those spaces. And I remember getting just dozens of emails in the following days from conservative people who said that they hadn't heard a defensive and anti-war perspective in those terms before. And there are opportunities to shake people out of the matrix if we just speak to them. And so I do think that opportunities that otherwise descend into yelling matches can be chances for people who are visionaries to contend in those spaces and to offer basically a different mode of debate, in addition, obviously, to the different content and the substantive alternatives that we offer.
Yeah, absolutely. Because when you're in those kinds of echo chambers in the far right or the far left kinds of media, you don't hear much of a different wide variety of perspectives. You hear a very curated viewpoint in order to keep you in the social bubble that they want you in. And I think that one of the ways to grow the opportunity to have politicians be willing to come on shows and debate would be to have more politicians like yourself and others come on social media platforms like mine and other debate platforms and have debates. And if these become popular enough, I think that would incentivize other politicians to want to be a part of this kind of popular way to interact and to express their ideas.
Totally. I was just looking at the chats coming in as you were talking, and it's fascinating. I see one suggestion that seems to come straight out of a sci-fi novel, The Circle, that Dave Eggers wrote, about putting body cams on representatives. I do think that there's I'm just getting lost in the comments. Sorry, I'll go back to you.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I did want to go back to the gun debate because it is rather prescient recently. It does seem like America has a majority consensus that we do want gun control, but Republicans make a few arguments that sound very reasonable. One is that guns are used in more self-defense cases. The CDC came out with that stat that it's like 500,000 to 3 million, probably around 1 million is like the estimate of self-defense gun usage, which is more than the amount of criminal gun usage. And that seems to be, if that was the case, a very good argument to maintain guns.
Those tend not to be assault rifles. I mean, and to whatever extent people in a defense situation are using assault rifles, that's paramilitary. If you're in a self-defense situation, it's a handgun you're talking about. And so these are very different kinds of instruments. A ban on assault weapons, which we had in place for a decade and which proved demonstrably effective in reducing gun violence, including mass shootings, that wouldn't run afoul of any legitimate interest in self-defense. The part here I'd want to particularly emphasize is that it's not just Republicans, Democrats too. There was a particular bill passed by Congress in 2005. It's called the PLCAA, Protecting Lawful Commerce in Arms Act. It's a corporate immunity protection. It protects the gun industry from civil liability to an even greater extent than tobacco manufacturers or auto manufacturers. Congress does this a lot. before, when we were talking about conflicts of interest, this is an example of how Congress puts money in its pocket by insulating the corporations in which members are personally invested from accountability through the courts to the public when they violate things like human rights. And they do this all the time. 2009 is my favorite example. That's the FISA Amendments Act, when Congress immunized the telecom industry for the mass surveillance net that people learned about 4 years later when Snowden revealed it. Congress had bent over backwards 4 years later to legalize everything that he revealed, because before it was flatly illegal. And if anybody caught the companies doing it, everybody could have sued the telecom companies. But Congress saw it coming and said, okay, well, whenever this gets out of the bag, we want to make sure the corporations don't pay a price for it. We're just going to pass this now. And that's what they did with the gun industry in 2005. Repealing the PLCAA is going to go a long way towards containing this, because when assault rifle manufacturers have to start paying out claims to the families of all the kids that end up getting murdered with them, whole different ball of wax. Beyond that, there are various loopholes that allow people to get access to firearms without completing federal required background checks. There's a huge loophole for unlicensed sellers. That should not be controversial to fix. There's a bit of a elephant in the room, let's say, that's important to acknowledge here, and that's the Second Amendment in the Supreme Court. Now, when we do revive the assault weapons ban, I fully anticipate a right-wing set of reactionaries on the Supreme Court to be a problem. This has been a problem my entire career. My very first case as a lawyer in 2003, I represented two members of Congress, bipartisan, they were the House co-sponsors of the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act of 2003. It was the last time Congress tried to take corporate money out of elections. This is an interesting case because when we talk about the corrupting influence of insider trading, that's one example. This is a whole different one. Corporate participations in the election campaign arena, right? And Congress recognized that this was a problem a generation ago. Russ Feingold and John McCain, Democrat from Wisconsin, Republican from Arizona, they were the Senate co-sponsors of BICRA. I represented Chris Shays and Marty Meehan, the House co-sponsors. We sued the Federal Election Commission to try to keep corporate money out of elections, and we won our case in 2006, 4 years before the Supreme Court and the Citizens United decision blew the door down. And so this is a case where we see the Supreme Court overturning acts of Congress, inviting corruption in ways that we can predict repeating themselves. For instance, when we pass the assault weapons ban, the court is going to be looming there with the Second Amendment in its hand, invoking any number of limiting principles. I have a whole plan to restrain the court. And a lot of people, I think, are finally starting to pay attention to it. My next job after I was fighting for campaign finance reform and LGBT marriage equality was trying to stop the right-wing takeover of our courts when I was at the American Constitution Society. I wrote an article in 2008 proposing to impose term limits on judges, 18-year staggered terms for the Supreme Court. It would do a lot of things. It would particularly force turnover on the bench, and it would check and balance the court. It would give us a neutral way, hopefully, to keep the court, whether on campaign finance or reproductive rights or the Second Amendment, from overturning acts of Congress and chaining us to crises, ultimately, that we should be able to legislate our way around.
Why 18 years? Why not a shorter period?
So the theory with 18 goes like this. Traditionally, people defend life tenure, saying that the job of a Supreme Court justice is not necessarily unique, but it's one in which institutional memory plays an especially important role. And that makes some sense, right? Because the whole point, stare decisis, is the principle that you're supposed to decide new cases based on deference to established precedents. Now, the hole in that bucket is that the weaponized, politicized Supreme Court cares nothing for stare decisis, so it's a complete canard. But if we were to embrace it on its terms, at least, without references to the current justices, we might say that 18 years gives you plenty of time to establish institutional memory. It's not so much time that you get to lord your influence over hundreds of millions of people beyond, any reasonable. For instance, at the moment, because we have life tenure, justices are selected largely on the basis of their age. Gorsuch, Kavanaugh, Barrett, Alito, Roberts, they all fit this pattern. These were young right-wing jurists selected precisely so that they could wield maximal influence over time. And that's a completely ridiculous gaming of the process. And so we shouldn't be rewarding that with indefinite life tenure. There's another piece here with 18-year terms. Because there's 9 justices, 18-year terms mean that every 2 years there would be a vacancy. So there would be complete predictability in the process. And this is a process that at the moment is not only completely unpredictable, but weaponized. Remember when Merrick Garland was nominated to fill a seat and the way the right wing delayed his appointment just so that they could then flip the White House and nominate their own alternative. In the face of that, compare Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, God bless her heart, may she rest in peace. She declined to retire strategically, as did her counterparts on the other side, meaning that, when you have one side that's strategically gaming its nominations and appointments and the other side that's playing as if it's a neutral process, it's kind of like when people talk about Democrats getting taken to the cleaners by the GOP all the time. The same thing happens. There's a jurisprudential equivalent of that. And now I'm getting lost in my eddies here. Where did we start with this? What was the beginning of this question?
Yeah, we were talking about the gun debate, and we led into how you had a plan to influence the courts so that they couldn't
Why 18 years? Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So that's some of the thinking on 18 years. It's enough time to build institutional memory. It's not so long that you can chain the future to the past. It allows regularity in the appointment schedule. And with that regularity and predictability, hopefully there'll be a little bit less politicization.
Yeah, awesome. So what is your position on the gun debate? Do you think we should go full Australia? Would that even work in America?
I mean, I think we need to particularly ban assault weapons. That's the first thing. We have to end the corporate liability provisions and force the gun lobby and industry to pay the costs for these. I mean, to even you could describe it as tragedies, but that's kind of stale. Ultimately, what I think we're talking about here are human rights violations, because whether it's from the Pentagon or the domestic weapons industry or the paramilitary policing establishment, we're talking about blood putting money in people's pockets. And I do think of that as a human rights violation, and we should force the industry to pay the cost of it. And I think that that's going to make a huge difference in terms of the kinds of weapons that are on the street. AR-15s have no legitimate use. I mean, these are weapons of war. They're not hunting rifles. They're made to explode human flesh, and they're very effective at it. They're so effective at it that the kids who got slaughtered last week, some of them couldn't even be identified except by their DNA remains. Why are there weapons like that being sold commercially available? That's absolutely senseless. It doesn't make any sense at all. And as long as we're on this subject of the Second Amendment, I brushed up against it just to throw out a flare here. We could chase this rabbit if you want to. It was enacted by the framers as a tool to prevent government tyranny. It's supposed to be a right to resistance. And in an age that we are in today of paramilitary policing, I don't think weapons connote any meaningful right to resistance. I would like to see the courts evolve the Second Amendment into an understanding that hackers, whistleblowers, and journalists should have an affirmative defense when exfiltrating data from the government in order to inform the public. That would be a meaningful rereading of the Second Amendment in today's context. And that's where I'd like to see the jurisprudence shift. In terms of gun rights, they're not rights in the first place. Until 2008, there was no individual right to bear arms. It was, as the text of the Second Amendment describes, it was inherent in a collective right shared by a militia. It was the right-wing Supreme Court in 2008 in the Heller decision that overturned gun control laws passed by the District of Columbia, where I lived at the time, and the city of Chicago, where I'd lived before, that were trying to respond to gun violence epidemics within their communities by passing regulations, sane ones. The one in DC was particularly aggressive. It was more like what you're describing. It was a blanket prohibition. In fact, the plaintiff in that case was a former police officer. And so the idea there was that this gun control law is so extreme that even retired police officers can't have firearms. And the court struck that down as being impermissible in the face of a newly created individual right to bear arms. And I do think that the right is much more a collective one than an individual one. So that also is a hole in a wall that we have to plug at some point. But I absolutely support restrictions on gun sales, on and removing the corporate immunity provisions. That's going to go a lot further than people might think, precisely because this is largely a market-driven problem. And so if you make the profiteers accountable, that's one way to reduce market-driven problems. Similarly, if we made the fossil fuel companies short of nationalizing them, if we just force them to pay the costs of climate-related catastrophes, these are levers that Congress can pull and historically has declined to pull because it's governed by Wall Street, not the people of the United States.
I got a super chat from one of my followers. Jesse asks, can you ask him how he defines an assault weapon? This brings up a really interesting point because the definition of assault weapon seems to be very vague, and gun companies especially play around that definition to make things that are essentially exactly like assault weapons, but they don't have a butt, so it doesn't qualify as a technical assault weapon.
Right.
And it seems like we need some kind of a formal way to define what an assault weapon is in order to enforce these kinds of an assault weapon bans. Because if we don't, then it seems like they can play around with just small changes to the gun to make it fit the criterion of a pistol.
I agree with your concern there, and to be frank, I'm not as granularly up to speed on what the precise definition should be. The most clever thing I've read about in this context is delineating the line at interchangeable magazines. Like a gun with a fixed magazine that you have to manually refill, that in itself would prevent many of the kinds of shootings that we've seen, because if a shooter has to take the time to refill a magazine, that's time during which they can be taken down. And interchangeable magazines reduce that time to seconds. And so just tactically speaking, these are weapons that would offer the same functionality if that's what you're into. If you want to explode your deer that you're supposedly hunting, like fine, do that. But the fact that you can switch the magazine out for another one with dozens of rounds, there's no sane reason for that. So at least requiring fixed magazines might be one potential delineator between the impermissible assault rifles and the ones that we might allow. I'm certainly open to learning here. And these are exactly the kinds of questions that ideally hearings explore, where you bring in people who have, frankly, greater expertise than I, so that policymakers can learn about this stuff. I do think that this has been an area where Congress has been completely asleep at the switch. And frankly, everybody in it deserves to be held accountable for it.
Do you have a way to try to solve the problem that most gun crimes are done with illegally obtained weapons, just from stealing family friends from back corner deals, like some of the loopholes, like the gun show loopholes? That's not like the predominant way people acquire illegal weapons. It seems to be mostly from just knowing family or friends who have them. How exactly would we solve this problem, since most gun violence is done from illegally obtained weapons?
Ultimately, gun violence is not just the guns, it's the violence, right? So there's crimes attendant to using them, and prosecuting those and potentially accessory crimes upstream. So if it's your weapon being used in a downstream, someone getting killed, for instance, if the person using it is being prosecuted for murder, maybe there's an opportunity for accessory crimes to people who provide tools that are ultimately used to kill people. That would be the case in other settings. And so, prosecutors tend to be very creative in often going after people who have no relationship to crime. So I would at least hope that in this situation, we could rely on the criminal justice system to show up for work and at least do the job it was intended for, especially as long as it's going to be, sending millions of people into industrialized slavery, like at least address these core cases. And that would be, someone providing a gun to someone who then uses it to kill someone. That is an accessory to the downstream offense.
Yeah. Earlier, you brought up the fact that you said Nancy Pelosi attacks her opponents. Would you mind talking about that a little bit?
Sure. Yeah, I appreciate you inviting me to do that. So there's an adage, it's often attributed to Gandhi, though I understand that's apocryphal. But when you challenge power, first they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, and then you win. And so when I won the jungle primary in 2020, I became the only Democrat to ever face Pelosi in a general election. 4 months before the election, predictably, come a series of smears. I want to locate the timeline here. So a week after the San Francisco Chronicle runs a front page story above the fold, Pelosi ignoring calls for a debate, I'm then the subject of a series of accusations stretching from misogyny to sexual misconduct. I was accused in a published article of sexual assault by an author who admitted it was false 2 months later. That story, incidentally, remains uncorrected to this day on the website of the Bay Area Reporter. I was smeared as supposedly starting wildfires. I was smeared in the middle of wildfire season, which I absolutely, of course, did not do. There were smears about all kinds of lies. I mean, every conceivable lie you could imagine, many of them leveraging racial and religious stereotypes, all orchestrated by Democratic Party actors. Several of them had worked on our campaign. We'd removed from our campaign after winning the primary, and this was how they rehabilitated themselves to the party establishment. And I saw political rewards handed out to the people who smeared me. And this was an apparatus absolutely incentivized at the top of the party leadership. In 2020, there was a rule in place. I'm glad it's no longer there. This was one of the things that the squad insisted upon when they voted for Pelosi as the speaker, that they remove the DCCC blacklist. This was the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee. It's the umbrella organization that supports incumbent Democrats in their reelection campaigns. It passed a rule under Pelosi's leadership saying that anyone who worked as a consultant or a staff person on a campaign for someone like me who was challenging an entrenched incumbent, that they would then be ineligible for any future work with the party. So what that basically incentivized was precisely what the middle tier of the party here rewarded. And there are sitting members of the Board of Supervisors. I'll name them. Dean Preston was part of this character assassination. There were other sitting members of the board who hired people who had documented roles in it. They include sitting board member Raphael Mandelman, former board members David Campos and Jane Kim. There's a city council member in Oakland running for the mayor's seat, Sheng Tao. All of these are elected office holders who either lied in public to support accusations leveraging racial and religious, false accusations leveraging racial and religious stereotypes, or hired people who did, and after their roles had been documented. And I don't think that there's actually a city in the country that can rival San Francisco in this particular pattern. I'm going to make this really sharp. San Francisco has a reputation for being one of the most progressive cities in the country, and I think it deserves it. And one layer. Underneath that layer is a mining town, which has challenges with white supremacy at least as severe as any other place I've lived, and they include rural Missouri, where I grew up, Washington, D.C., where I've worked for 10 years, spent a summer in Houston, spent a season in Salt Lake City. San Francisco, I think, is among the most racist cities in the country, and I'm going to lay out my reasons for saying that. First, 75% of our Black residents have been removed in the last generation. Find me an example of ethnic cleansing like that. We talked a few minutes ago about the destruction of Black wealth in the Fillmore, when an entire neighborhood was effectively razed to the ground and thousands of people were displaced. It's one of the reasons why our Black population collapsed. One of our last remaining Black enclaves, Bayview Hunters Point, is the site right now, has been, of one of our nation's most egregious environmental justice calamities. The U.S. Navy poisoned that entire neighborhood for 50 years because it was cleaning ships returning from test blasts in the South Pacific. So that whole neighborhood is radioactive. It's the last Black enclave in San Francisco. It's represented in Congress by Nancy Pelosi. No one outside, in fact, many people in San Francisco have no idea it exists or that this problem has been there. And these are just some examples. You know, I'm not the first candidate of color to be smeared in San Francisco by white writers who call themselves progressive. I'll name their names too. Tim Redmond is the editor at 48 Hills. He smeared a Black lawyer before me who ran for the D5 seat, Julian Davis. Joe Eskenazi at Mission Local. After they both smeared me, they smeared another Latino leader in the Mission who was widely rumored to be the next supervisor representing that district. I'm one in a continuing series of leftist men of color in San Francisco who have faced racially leveraged accusation. I want to make one thing clear. I've never contended that the accusations towards me were racially motivated. I've contended and observed simply that they were racially opportunistic. And when you accuse people of color and immigrants falsely of misconduct for the purposes of misleading voters, that's not just an attack on the subjects of those lies. That was an attack on the public by figures including journalists and elected officials. And, you know, I'm not a politician. I don't do what's politically popular. I'm a constitutional actor. I'm an accountability agent. So I call out corruption wherever I see it. And it unfortunately stretches across the political spectrum in the city. And it brings me no joy to observe. It brought me a lot less joy to experience it, I'll tell you that. Our city was denied a legitimate election in 2020 for this seat. And now that the whistleblowers have finally been heard and the evidence has been documented of the character assassination on which Nancy Pelosi relied to secure her reelection in 2020, I'm looking forward to a legitimate election this fall.
So a couple of really interesting points there. The one that you brought up first was you said that there was a law that if somebody worked for a challenger of an incumbent, that they couldn't be hired in the future for any like working politician.
Not a law, it was a policy that the DCCC passed. So it had no government backing. This was just the Democratic Party decided that one way it was going to protect its incumbents against particularly left-wing challengers was to intimidate consultants and professional campaign staff from working for people like me by saying, if you ever work for anybody like that, you're never working for anybody of the rest of us again. And it's one reason why I ended up working with relatively inexperienced people, because experienced people with careers can't cross that line, right? This is basically how gangs operate. And so this is one of the many ways in which the Democratic Party put its interests before those of the voters. That's a consistent pattern, from incumbent stocking debates, insider trading. There's lots of examples of that, but that's just, it's one example of that broader pattern.
Yeah, that seems obviously corrupt. That if you're saying that if you even work for my opponent, doesn't matter if you're doing a good job, you will not be allowed any kind of job opportunity in the field that you're most interested in. That seems like a terrible, horrible, immoral policy that we should definitely be bringing to the forefront of the problems of the Democratic and Republican Party, because I imagine they probably do the same thing.
Yes, and even that's the tip of the iceberg, because it's not just the case that the party decided that. Journalists printed accusations by party operatives incentivized by that rule without observing the fact that it created a conflict of interest. So the transparent political motivation behind these accusations was disregarded by journalists leaning into what the editors of the San Francisco Bayview, it's our city's black newspaper, they called what I went through in 2020 a civic lynching, orchestrated to protect the most powerful Democrat in the House. At the same time that a right-wing president is running around the country calling immigrants rapists, that's how Pelosi skated to re-election, by her party patronage network smearing me. And it's offensive to every conceivable value. It's not just offensive to race and inclusion. It's not just Islamophobic. It's not just racist. It's not just disinformation. It's not just an attack on election security. It's not just an abdication of press ethics. There was this spring, in I think it was March 2022, a news story published documenting that the white progressive journalists who were smearing me, Joe Eskenazi, Tim Redmond, Joe Garofoli, Stuart Schuffman, that they were taking money under the table from a PR firm that was smearing me. And when you have journalists taking money from PR firms to subject candidates to racist smears, serving the business interests of the PR firms and the political interests of the people paying the money, that's a problem. And I don't think there's a city in this country where that can go down. Only in San Francisco could that happen. And, this city has a pretty wide chasm between the myth and the reality and the rhetoric and what we live up to. And I hope ultimately to, again, as an agent of accountability, to help our city live up to our values.
So a few other things you mentioned. One was that you don't think that the insults were racially, or were targeting your race, but were racially convenient. By that, do you mean something like if the insult or whatever is targeted at someone of color, it's more likely to be accepted because of their color or something like along those lines?
Well, yeah, exactly. It's the difference between recognizing, many people think of white supremacy as an ideology, but it's in fact a social condition, which is to say you don't need to have animus or prejudice in order for an act to be racist. It just has to be an ignorant or opportunistic act leveraging stereotypes, right? With the people who smeared me did it for political reasons. They were politically motivated. But when you lie about people of color and immigrants, leveraging stereotypes for political motivations or political purposes, that is racist, full stop, period. In fact, it's more racist than if it was simply an extension of prejudice, because the person I am challenging is a white oligarch, right? I mean, this was all ultimately in the service of defending an oligarch from electoral accountability. That's a component of white supremacy. So both in its character of the smear campaign and the purpose of the smear campaign, all of it was reflective of white supremacy. And this was among people who described themselves, many of them, as progressives and socialists, but because they are political actors deferring to a party establishment, but And it would be one thing, if they wanted to support the party establishment and critique me for something I said or something I did or one of my positions, that would be legitimate. But to try to hang a bunch of fake skeletons in somebody's closet, to just spin fabrications and then inflate them even beyond what they were. I should make this clear. So people I'd removed from my team found someone who'd falsely accused me of harassment. This was someone with a long history of accusing anti-war politicians of harassment. They then brought that person to the press, came up with their own independent lies about misogyny in the workplace, inflated the two together into this accusation of sexual assault, and then took that to the international media. And because it served Pelosi's interests, the Democratic Party got behind it. I was facing a unique combination of the K-Hive and Dramatic Socialites of America chapters around the country that were smearing me at the same time. And when you take heat from literally across the entire political spectrum for the crime of challenging corporate corruption, that was one way in which I knew I was doing something right. And also when I came to recognize just how vast, we were asking me maybe half an hour ago about how these patterns continue, right? How do corporations wield such control over the political process? It's not just a Congress of millionaires filling their pockets. This is how they respond when they're challenged. Alex Morse faced a very similar pattern in Western Massachusetts when he challenged Richie Neal. He challenged a very powerful member of Congress. He did so very effectively. And in order to kneecap him, they came up with a bunch of homophobic smears. DSA chapters, in fact, did the same thing to another candidate in Boston, Hassan Lecky. It happened more recently to one in DC. This is a pattern across what passes to be the organized left in this country, which is not left at all. In fact, if I look at the pattern emerging, it seems to me that the relationship between some of the groups that claim to be on the left, in particularly DSA, is counter-revolutionary. They have the same role with respect to socialism that the CIA does to democracy, organizations that use a word a lot, but then seem to systematically undermine it more often than not. And well, certainly in the case of the CIA's case, all the time. I think DSA does some things that are helpful, but the way that they serially kneecap congressional candidates across the country, leveraging racist smears, unfortunately renders it more racist than any conservative organization I've ever encountered. And again, that doesn't bring me any joy to reflect upon, but it does demand observation.
I did want to go back to what you mentioned earlier. You said that 75% of the minorities in San Francisco were pushed out. Is that due to gentrification?
Black residents in particular. We still have a substantial Latino community, and there's a very substantial Asian community, both South Asian and East Asian, as well as kind of everybody in between. But our African-American population has fallen from about 12% 20 years ago to about 4% now. And that reflects gentrification as the primary driver for that. That in itself drills down and boils down into other things. We talked about when the urban redevelopment destroyed the Fillmore. We talked about affordable housing as a challenge here. That's a very big one. There's other challenges in San Francisco, environmental justice, for instance. I think a lot of people just didn't want to get sick, right? So gentrification happens through lots of different mechanisms. Policing is one vector for this. It can be, depending on the color of your skin, a hostile place. Many parts of America are. And, I'm thinking of the unfortunate litany of unarmed San Franciscans who've been gunned down by the SFPD, including one just last week. I was at a memorial for another young man, Alex Nieto, earlier this year, who the cops shot at him 59 times. And this was a kid who was like on his break from serving as a bouncer at a nightclub, having a burrito in a park. And somebody sees a kid having a burrito in a park and decides to call the cops, because that's what you do, I guess, in gentrifying San Francisco. So that's gentrification through policing. And I think a lot of people seeing unarmed people gunned down, that might be a reason if they have families to move elsewhere. So gentrification happens through housing. It happens through policing. It happens through poisoning neighborhoods, like when the soil, like in Hunters Point, is radioactive. There's lots of different ways. Employment discrimination is unfortunately a phenomenon here in San Francisco. And so I think those are all different dimensions of the forces that have displaced so many communities here.
Yeah, I also wanted to ask about that. The nuclear cleaning of the ships, is that due to zoning laws and the zoning law discrimination kind of thing?
That's interesting. Redlining as it pertains to Hunters Point, perhaps. I think it frankly is more reflective just of military industrial complex issues. So, how we have foreign military bases in dozens of countries around the world. This is one of the hundreds that we have within the United States. This was the site, the Hunters Point shipyard. This was the site where the bombs that were detonated over Hiroshima and Nagasaki were built. And it's where the ships that were returning from the bomb blast were cleaned. So it was basically a site of nuclear manufacture. Redlining pertains usually more to like either zoning or bank. Sometimes banks decide, not even elected bodies, where the red lines are. But I don't think that applied so much here. I suppose there's a way you could describe it, certainly, where Black residents in an era where they couldn't live outside. Well, I think it's a stretch. I don't think that was so much. There's an attenuated connection, certainly, but I don't think it was the primary driver of this particular crisis. This is much more the Pentagon, ultimately, and its impunity for human rights violations, not just abroad, but right here in the United States, right here in San Francisco, the district represented by the most powerful member of the House, who can't seem to be bothered to talk about it or do anything about it. In fact, I'll make that sharper. Nancy Pelosi did play a role in Hunters Point. She particularly helped privatize the land from the shipyard, on which thousands of housing units have now been built, all of which are radioactive, the people of which are being poisoned and who are now suing the Navy, the contractor responsible for the cleanup, the subcontractor responsible for the cleanup. There are police officers suing the Navy right now over this. And to the extent Pelosi's played any role, it was ultimately putting more people at harm in order to fill the pockets of the real estate community.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking, is that in those kind of zoning districts where there's like either an industrial body or some kind of a negative environmental factor, those housing environments are less desirable and end up being filled with minority individuals because those are the ones who can afford to live there.
That's a fair assessment. That's a totally fair assessment at that level. Yes.
Awesome. Well, we've been going for about an hour. I really appreciate you coming on. It was a great conversation. Would you mind telling people where they can find you, how they can support you and your goal and mission?
Thank you, Tom. I appreciate that. Folks can find us online at shahidforchange.us. We have a short link now, shahid.fyi. We're also on all the social media links, social media platforms, Twitter, YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, at Shahid for Change. You can volunteer from anywhere in the country. There's lots of ways to plug in, even from afar. And any American or legally a lawful permanent resident can donate to the campaign. And facing an oligarch with vastly more resources, I would simply plead for the support with anybody who shares that interest in ending corruption to defend the future from the failures of the past. And thank you for bringing me on. I appreciate this conversation too.
Absolutely. Thanks again. And I'm going to work on connecting with my local Augsburg College debate group, see if we can get a debate with you and Nancy Pelosi. That would be awesome.
Right on. I look forward to it.
All right. See you later. Have a nice day.